you meta-reflexively include the observer in big history itself. And the second is the ontic effects of all interpretation vis-a-vis the becoming of reality itself. So it's not just scholarly interpretation of big history that has ontological effects in reality. Humans spontaneously generate big histories, and this has ontological consequences. We were talking about this in the last session, actually, about the world communistic revolutions themselves being caused by big history. Marxism was a big history, and that had ontological effects in reality. Or you could even interpret 9/11 as caused by a big history, that it had ontological effects in reality, that the very big history the big histories themselves have consequences. And I think this is enormously important when we think about the future spread and distribution of big history, where we're trying to, David Christian explicitly said that he wants big history taught in every school and every program and all the curriculums. So the very way in which humans constitute big histories in their minds will have impacts in reality itself. Sorry, did you have
Yeah, I've got a question. Could you just explain how 9/11 was a consequence of big history?
Islam is a total vision of reality, same as Christianity is a total vision of reality, and that these total visions of reality themselves affect reality. Yep.
Can I suggest you use the word meta-narrative rather than keep using big history? They are big histories, but...
Well, big history has a grand unified narrative, that this is sort of the goal of big history.
You can say the meta-narrative of big history. I'm just saying because it's confusing, because we all think of big history as one thing and you're using it in a different way.
Yeah, I'll try and go deeper into this. Yep.
Sorry, you were talking about ontological effects.
Yep.
It says ontic effects over there.
Yeah.
Is there a difference?
It's just
a derivation.
Just a derivative. Yeah, it's the same, just a different way of saying ontology. You just say it in this context, I think.
Not everybody in here might be have philosophy background. Does everybody understand ontological? Believe me, it's okay to raise your hand if you don't, because not everybody's a philosopher.
For Heidegger, this is the biggest distinction there is in philosophy between the ontic and the ontological. So that's why I'm asking.
Oh, okay.
Well, just that it has effects. It has effects on being itself.
On society.
Yeah.
In your case.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it has consequences for the becoming.
Or in the being of the appearance.
Well, I think the relationship between being and appearing. To me anyway, the interesting question is this relationship between the positive quality of being and the appearance of being to itself. So how this relationship plays out in big historical context. Sorry. So for me, and this is sort of jumping off of a program that was being held yesterday, where the emphasis was on big history as a cultural movement and big history as a psychoanalytic construct also, which is that there's a radical subject-object entanglement is basically how I feel like we need to approach big history, and that the subject in the current construction of big history has sort of not been considered or not been included in the very theoretical ground of big history. So for me, what I'm inspired by are types of knowledge where the subject and object are entangled in the theoretical ground of the subject itself, where the subject's knowledge actually affects reality itself. So historical dialectics is an example, psychoanalysis is an example, quantum physics is an example, and higher order cybernetics is an example where the subject and the object are themselves radically entangled. Just various thinkers that have I think thought through very deeply the nature of subject-object entanglement, from Hegel and Marx, who constructed their own historical dialectics, to Freud and Heidegger, etc. And go into each of them would take too much time.
Cadell people.
Sorry?
Old people.
Yeah. Well, there's a tradition.
They were
young.
Yeah.
Bored. I'm not sure. Okay. So, in sort of the way big history is structured at the moment, it's an attempt at a total vision of reality, and that this total vision of reality is constructed from Big Bang to global civilization. So this would be the symbolic imaginary dimension of big history. And then its basic structure is that you have one physical object, the Big Bang to global civilization, and then you have the multiplicity of subjective interpretations of that one physical object. And from this sort of basic structure, the key dimension to me in regards to the multiplicity of subjective interpretation is that the multiplicity of subjective interpretation has to be grounded in either complexity science or cosmic evolution to be, in some sense, legitimized. That the complexity science of the cosmic evolution legitimizes the very subjective interpretation of the one object. And that what we've gotten from this basically are two things. We've gotten an energy density metric, so that we could understand Big Bang to global civilization through complexity thresholds related to energy density. And the other way this has been interpreted is through information processing or algorithmic processes, where you can interpret Big Bang to global civilization in complexity thresholds related to information. So then the basic structure here of the big history would be the one and the multiplicity, that you have the one physical object and then the multiplicity of subjective interpretation. And this sort of is the ontological ground of the big history construction itself. In my own, again, I wrote a paper, Big History in the Deep Future. And in this, it took me a while, and I used this project in some sense to deconstruct myself and analyze myself and how I was approaching big history. And where I was, it's a fine paper, but where I was disappointed with the paper is that I felt like big history didn't add any new way of seeing reality. That I felt like that big history isn't really any different than cosmic evolution. It's just sort of a story that uses cosmic evolution as its scientific ground. And so then I wasn't able to clearly distinguish what is big history as distinct from cosmic evolution, and I haven't really gotten a good answer to that. Even if I asked David Christian, he said he didn't really know. Then the second thing was that I didn't feel like big history was capable of formulating an authentic research program of its own, where you could say, this is what big history does, this is its methodological approach, as distinct from anything else we do, like, say, for example, cosmic evolution or complexity science, which are subjects that are in themselves have their own methodological ground. I mean, in the worst case scenario, you could say big history is mimicking cosmic evolution by sort of using its basic methodology and then framing it in a sort of narrative. But I don't think this is... I think the potential of big history is much greater than that. I think big history can be much more than just a repetition of cosmic evolution, basically. And then the way to approach this for me is based on also something we were talking about in the last session with David Christian and Fred Spear about the importance of understanding universality. And I think that what big history is trying to get at is a new form of universality that has always existed in the past. Universality was a feature of all religions, pretty much. And even the first scientists and the first historians, and like for example Hegel, really attempted to get universality and grab universality, and then this sort of fell apart in the 20th century as the basic narrative. We had the disparate disciplines, etc. I think where the current thought field is, and this is from my perspective, I don't know if I'm sure everyone else has a different view, where the thought field is for me in regard to universality is you basically have three offers. One is humanist deconstruction, so this is like Foucault and Derrida, where the universality itself is deconstruction. That the only universality is that we should all deconstruct ourselves. That any spontaneous attempt for universality is in itself naive. And that this should be sort of reflectively incorporated into any attempt at universality. That you should have the kernel of deconstruction in every system you build. The second attempt at universality for me is, and is quite widespread, is basically like a New Age or an Eastern void spirituality, where the universality itself is the negation of the world. So you negate the world, you go into the void, and that void is the universality. The third attempt at universality, I think, is still science of the object, that you basically have universal principles, so you have patterns in reality, and you try to understand these patterns in reality through universal principles, and this is your attempt at universality. For me, I think obviously big history's aligned itself with science of the object. So these are the three forms of universality that I feel that are in the thought field today. You have deconstruction, you have void spirituality, and you have science of the object. And of course, big history's aligned itself with science of the object. It's trying to basically create a grand narrative built around unifying principles of cosmic evolution. And in this sort of alignment with science of the object form of universality, I think at big history conferences, it's sort of like, we hope the void spiritualists will just go away. It's sort of like a rejection or a negation of New Age spirituality. The deconstructionists are not really included. If there is a deconstructionist, it's sort of like, what is he saying? Why are we even doing this, etc. So there's sort of this spontaneous alignment to one form of universality, and I guess my challenge to big history is, how can we think out of this very thought field itself? How can we synthesize these three different forms of universality and try to find a totally new form of universality, a totally new way of seeing that desire. So for this, I tried to go to basically positing the presuppositions that we bring certain presuppositions to the study of big history, and that these very presuppositions need to be challenged, or at least thought through. That we shouldn't be too quick to cling to these presuppositions as reality. They're just abstractions, of course, but I would say the ideology today is basically complexity science, and complexity science to me is posited as the way in which we can do two enormous things, which I think we should try and do. But if I'm just saying, is complexity science the way we can do this? So the first thing that complexity science has posited we can do is to bridge this impossible duality between micro and macro reality. That the complexity science narrative in cosmic evolution can somehow unify all of human knowledge and then make sense of the whole in some way that quantum physics and cosmology can't. But I think the first red flag for me in experimenting with big history is that you bring all of the disparate subjects together into one whole, but then you don't get anything qualitatively new. Like Fred Spear's course on big history was a good example of that, where he brought an astronomer, a geologist, a biologist, a historian, and that was the course of big history. But no qualitatively new way of seeing came out of that. It was just unifying disparate disciplines into one objective linear teleology. And I think this is what you get with big history. You get an objective linear teleology that's repetitively positivized. So you get this repetition of the pre-human real, and then we all get together and we tell each other stories of the pre-human real. And then my question is, why are we even doing that? Getting together and telling each other stories of the pre-human real. What's the point of that? And then the second question is, it doesn't bring any positive content to science. It's aligned with scientific universality, but it doesn't bring any positive content to science itself. So why is this? Why is it that you align with scientific universality, but you don't bring any positive new content to science? You're just organizing the knowledge that's discovered in the disparate disciplines. So this to me is another challenge. And I think it's something we should totally do. I think we should totally be 100% going for a unification of reality. I think we should be trying to think a type of knowledge where we can break the impossible duality between micro and macro reality. I think this is something that physicists can't do. I mean, they've been trying to do this for almost a century now, and they can't bridge micro and macro reality. They're stuck in certain frameworks of thinking that prevent them from unifying these two areas of their knowledge that are themselves in contradiction. And then in terms of unifying all of human knowledge, I think, then the question is complexity science the way to do this, or do we need something totally different? And that's sort of where I am. Again, when I think about big history and positing of presuppositions again, I think in regards the fact that the grand unified story, as big history sort of explains it, is sort of an abstract universality. It's an abstraction. And I think humans spontaneously tend towards universality, but I think that what they spontaneously tend towards is a concrete universality. It's something that you want to experience directly. I think this is, for example, like why Buddhism is so popular in the West. It's because it's the only form of concrete universality that is in some sense legitimized with direct experience. Like people don't believe in praying to God anymore, so they say, well, let's just go into the void type of thing. And that's their concrete engagement with universality. But at the same time, for big history, I think if we're trying to think a new type of knowledge and a type of direct engagement with universality, we need to think something totally different. I don't think I don't think anyone's happy with deconstruction. I don't even think people in deconstruction circles are happy with deconstruction. And again, Buddhism and science have their own problems with confronting concrete universality. So how can we think of something totally different? A different way of approaching grand unified narrative. And I think I'll talk about these two things specifically in regards to the way big history is structured now. Remember the structure of the one and the multiplicity. I think the danger of the grand unified narrative, or the trap, is the danger of the single story. I don't know if anyone's ever listened to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's talk on TED about the danger of the single story, but I think this basic structure emerges in big history, where what she was talking about in regards to her experience growing up in Africa was that the West had one single story of Africa, and that this one single story of Africa masked a very complex multiplicity of actual reality in Africa, which is not anything like the one single story that the West has of Africa. And I think the same thing in some case happens is with the basic structure of big history, where you have one single story which masks an inherent multiplicity of big histories, and the way people see big history and the way people approach universality. And I think that this is a difficult problem, I think, to solve, is how do we approach universality in a grand unified narrative without falling into a single story. So the way for me to sort of offer a constructive alternative to the way of seeing big history is basically three core points that I would like to say, which I think concretely negate a grounding of big history and complexity science itself. So the first is the transcendental constitution of reality, and that's just imagination. So the best example of that is that our reality, the way we approach reality itself, is in a circle with the imagination. You can't get out of the fact that it's first grounded in the imagination. So every big history is itself in the imaginary dimension. The best example of this is, for example, the formulation of general relativity by Einstein. That if you look at the general relativity of Einstein, it's not even possible without the imaginary thought experiment of the free-falling observer. That he needs the imaginary constitution of this thought experiment in order to formulate general relativity. So you can't escape the imagination, basically. It's a circle you're in a loop with, and you're not obviously directly interacting with the physical reality. It's imagination first. And even studying kids is awesome for this. Kids are directly interacting with the imagination. The imagination goes out over physical reality, and then they insert symbols in the imaginary field. So that's the first, is that you start with the imagination as the transcendental constitution of reality. The second is, how do we understand the subjective becoming of the multiplicity of narratives itself? So every human has a sort of a narrative of totality, a narrative of what they think of as the whole of reality. And how do you understand the becoming of this very narrative itself? The becoming of this multiplicity. And then the third is the retroactive or eventual nature of history, that historical events occur that you couldn't predict ahead of time, and then in retrospect they change history itself. So the way you conceive of the history of reality is itself affected by events in history. So, I mean, good example of that would be Darwinian evolution, where before Darwinian evolution you had a certain historical understanding of the history of reality, and then Darwinian evolution emerges, and the very way you conceptualize the history of reality changes. So how to incorporate this eventual retroactive nature into big history theory itself. Yeah.
Can you define becoming in part? Just for the really naive people, perhaps.
I guess you could think about it like, for example, there are some people talking about process and event. That becoming is a process. That humans are becoming in our very nature. That there's parts of our nature that, like, we're not like any other species in the sense that, like, lions or chimpanzees or dolphins, like if you were to go 500 years into the future, like they would still basically be the same form. But humans are in a radical state of becoming because of our symbolic activity, because of our technological advance, that 500 years in the future, our very form will be different. You know, and that's spoken to with singularity theory and stuff like that also. So for me, when you take all of these things into consideration, the transcendental constitution of reality, imagination, the becoming of the symbolic multiplicity itself, and then the eventual retrospective nature of history, you have to think here, or the question for me is, can we think of big historical dialectics? And for me, a big historical dialectics would be in contrast to the complexity narratives. That what we have are complexity narratives. We have narratives of information or energy processes through complexity thresholds. But this isn't understood dialectically. And for example, we already have examples of how to ground dialectics, because when the first big histories were made, I think we could make the case that what Hegel or Marx tried to do were in themselves big histories, and they were foundationally dialectical. Now, I'm not saying we copy Hegel and Marx and we just go back to the old dialectics, but I'm saying how can we think of big historical dialectics? I think that would be a different type of dialectical process. Basically, what I think here is big history is legitimized by scientific universality, the complexity science narrative. And this very scientific culture is strongly positing a technological singularity. Now, I'm not saying that they're right or wrong, but they're positing some artificial general intelligence, post-humans, transhumans, some sort of next stage, some sort of stage where the very way in which reality is constituted changes. So my question is, can big history approach and interpret this evental process? You know, if the way the appearances are themselves going to change, how does big history approach this changing of the very way we understand reality? So obviously, on its most basic level, whether it's AGI or whether it's posthumans or whether it's transhumans or whatever it is, it's a phenomenological phase transition where the very way in which the phenomena are understood changes. And then so I would start with a type of ontology of beings and language, that where beings and language, you start with symbolic mind and then you reason out from there and you try to question the very presuppositions that constitute how we think of the pre-human, the non-human, and the post-human reals. I mean, and try and build a dialectical frame within this way of approaching. It's just, could be totally wrong. But then examples of this way of seeing reality in a different way. We have examples in the past where forms of knowledge emerged that couldn't be anticipated ahead of time, but then when they emerge, they change the very way you see reality itself. So, examples I've gone through like Darwinian evolution or Marxism, communism, general relativity, quantum mechanics. And I think big history could offer a new way of seeing reality in the way that these forms of knowledge emerge, but thinking through what that form of knowledge is difficult. Where I start here is with the maxim of Descartes and Spinoza of a true idea must agree with its object. So a good example of this would be like the Higgs particle, right? That the Higgs particle isn't verified until, like the Higgs is a theory until we empirically discover the Higgs. Then it's all of a sudden agreeing with the object. So this approach to our understanding of reality has been successful in physics, chemistry, biology, geology, astronomy, that in some sense we have a way of understanding the things that surround us. But I think this sort of has failed with the human sciences, and in many ways people see the human sciences as failures in comparison to the standards that we hold physics and biology and chemistry to. And I think it's the way we see humans as an object, that we approach studying humans in the same way that the scientists approach physics, biology, chemistry, and so on. That there needs to be a change in the way we see the object, and I don't have enough time to go into it. This would be an interesting thing to go into. But basically, it's that I think we need to have the focus on the subject's object, that the subject itself has an object, a virtual object, that it cares about, it structures its whole reality. So that you don't look at humans from the outside. Like the best way for me to understand any of you isn't to look at you on the outside and your behavior, but to actually understand your virtual object, how you become with that virtual object, and how you ground that virtual object, and how you use that object to explain the whole of reality. So to me, the strange thing about humans is that we have a virtual object that strives for universality and in some sense is capable of constructing a total vision of reality. So how do we understand the very becoming of humans with this virtual object? So this would be obvious. I'm not negating the object of science for the subject like a type of radical subjectivism, but rather what is the object that the subject cares about? And how do we understand the very dialectical movement of the object that the subject cares about so much? And I think these break traditional dualities, like like you hear many dualities like subject, object, human world, agent system, organism environment, being geometry, spirit nature. All of these dualities, in some sense for me anyway, are broken with this notion. So I guess the foundations of like a big history for me would be to explore the consequences of the virtual fantasy object that's capable of generating a total vision of reality. That each human in some sense possesses a big history, and that we should understand the very becoming of this desire. I guess I would just say that I think these are both. This is basically my offer is that these are both valid. I think I don't think one negates the other, but they're just two different ways of looking at big history. So one, you have the basic formula of the one and the multiplicity. So you have the one physical real and the multiplicity of subjective interpretation, which is currently the way we see big history. And then you have this inversion as you approach a potential singularity, but who knows what the singularity is, which is that you have a multiplicity of subjective interpretation where each subject creates a total vision of reality, and that multiplicity is itself a one. So it's just literally inverting it here. So you invert the scientific real for the imaginary real, and then the emphasis would be on the actual empirical effects of fantasy and reality. That fantasy has empirical effects, or fantasy is real, and is itself what is immanent in human becoming. I guess that's just going over the core of the offer, but we can skip it if you guys want to go to questions.
It seems like people want to ask some questions, so
Okay, we'll just go to that then.
you have a final conclusion.
Yeah, well, that was the core of what I wanted to say anyway.
Very good. Yeah, questions?
May I ask? I think, science, I'm a geologist,
Okay.
and the Earth breaks down everything and then rebuilds it, and science is part of the Earth. So science should really deconstruct completely everything all the time, and then build itself up again. And that's what they have to do. It's not copying and pasting all these disciplines that they have to do. It's just creating something totally new, I think. And that's big history. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I'm totally for constructing something totally new.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
That's what I'm trying to do.
I'll give you an example, if I may.
Yep.
About humanity.
Okay.
And people all these scientists of humanity, are all fundamentally anthropocentric, because always put the humans in the middle, and they're all about humans and the basic thought about it is that we are organizing the planet. It's ours, our problem.
Could you please pose the question?
Well, yes.
We have a little time, so.
I'm sorry. But the thing is that, actually, well, I'll come back to that.
Okay.
It's essential. It's exactly what you're talking
I'll
about.
try to come back.
We'll
to
talk after.
Yeah, this gentleman in the back.
Yeah, okay, so I'm Wyken Seagrave. So I think you said, I came in a bit late, but I think you said that you didn't understand why we were looking at big history, is that right? An early stage? No, okay.
Well,
So,
I'm massively pro big history.
Okay.
I love big history. All I'm trying to say is that the mystery for me about big history is that the point is to bring all the subjects together and have a field that's really interdisciplinary. And the mystery for me is that you bring all the subjects together and then no new way of seeing comes out. You just organize all of the fields that exist as they are. So-
I don't agree. I'm looking at it from the scientific point of view, okay? And when you see how physics and then chemistry and then biology are linked together, because you couldn't have chemistry without the physics, you couldn't have biology. How you see when they're all linked together, then a new vision emerges. What we're talking about
But
here.
that's cosmic evolution. So for me, the big challenge is why do we have big history if it's just cosmic
But
evolution?
surely cosmic-
because cosmic evolution predates big history, and is big history just ripping off cosmic evolution's methodology? Because that's what it looks like.
To me, cosmic evolution sort of doesn't cover any of the fine detail about, human history doesn't figure within cosmic evolution
It
at all.
does. It's included in it's included what cosmic evolution, from the very statements of like people like Eric Jason say about cosmic evolution, that it's about general processes in the universe at large, general evolutionary change in the universe at large. And what it sees as the flaw in big history is its localness and its subjective interpretation. That big history is more interested in the subjective interpretation of humans and the relationship of humans and the universe. So what I'm saying is that why don't we have big history that has its own methodology that is specifically focused on how the human constitutes a total vision of reality, and that this is inherently a multiplicity, that you can't just tether it to the scientific real. That misses the point, because people have big histories in their mind, or grand unified narratives, or total visions of reality that themselves have effects in reality. So we could study, it's just a meta-reflective notion of including the observer in the object, that you have to include the empirical effects of the observer.
This gentleman right here.
Yeah, I really love the talk, so thank you for that. And you started the talk by saying Plato would still think we are not confronting the real.
Well, that's my interpretation.
Yeah, I somewhere agree with what you're saying, because I think that with all of science and with most of what we're doing, we are playing with symbols, we're playing with concepts, reconstructing and rigging concepts, which is in a way superficial, but with which we can still uncover really profound truths, like how space-time works and all these things.
Yeah.
But basically we're still working on the upper layer of our mind, we're working with the symbols that our mind creates. And I think with confronting the real, what is somewhere meant is that we have to confront the way our mind works itself, because we are a natural process in effect. And we are the only natural process that we in this lifespan experience.
Yep.
And I find that in science we have this division of subject and object, which reflects that we don't really see ourselves as a natural phenomenon. We are not being controlled by nature in any way, we are not controlling nature, but we are nature in effect. We are like a flower blooming or whatever. And that has something very deeply spiritual to it, because by observing yourself, you observe nature happening. And at a certain point you said that to understand the other person, maybe we should try to imagine what the other person is going on in their mind, because like that we would be confronting the actual reality of the other person. But I think that we won't ever be able to get inside the person's mind.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah, we are only constantly in our own being.
I think one of the deadliest traps of singularity theory is precisely intrasubjective notions. Mm-hmm. This idea that we're all going to merge into a single entity. I think this should be resisted totally. I don't think it makes any sense. I think we're stuck in our intrasubjective space. We can't directly make contact with each other intrasubjectively. Yeah. But it's because that when we're talking to each other, like me and you right now, I'm really in dialogue with my virtual object, and you're in dialogue with your virtual object, and we're trying as best as we can to understand each other's virtual objects, but we're never going to.
Yeah.
But as long as we're able to reflectively take this into account, it would help us in our becoming. It would help us understanding the multiplicity of becoming.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with that. And I think to actually make the jump that you are suggesting will really require a complete revolutionization of how we look at ourselves, because it would ask us to include ourselves in the picture of nature, which would completely take away the idea of an ego that we have. And that then we come to somewhat a Buddhistic point of view of seeing yourself as part of the whole. And then we wouldn't have any conflicts either. We wouldn't have wars, we wouldn't have greed. And all.
Well, I don't know about that. I'm sure we'll still have conflict.
I want to give some other people a chance. This gentleman here wants to say something.
I really enjoyed the paper, and part of it took me back to graduate school, and what's wonderful about graduate school is that you get exposed to so many really grand ideas from really powerful thinkers. It's like juggling 11 spheres, each one of which is damn near infinite in its own complexity.
This sounds nice. I like juggling lots of infinite spheres.
Yeah. I want to offer a suggestion from left field for a method that I think can work. And my bias first is that I think the notion of getting a total vision of reality is wrong.
It's fantasy.
It isn't ever going to happen.
I agree.
And so the method that I think big history should follow too, and at least I want to offer it to you just to see if it triggers anything, comes from one of my very favorite quotes from a great historian whose name I can't remember. And the quote is, "And the chaos acquires order by virtue of what we choose to omit."
Yes.
And so with each of our grand visions, we've now
Yeah.
we've now achieved order from chaos, and then the method is to say, all right, what has been omitted from this? And if we can't include it in this, then that's where we are.
Our default,
believe that.
our default ideology is a brutal simplification, and that's how because we don't want to operate in perpetual chaos in our symbolic sphere. We want our symbolic sphere to be ordered,
Right.
and so we engage in a brutal simplification. And I think this is maybe the danger of the single story, that you enter into this brutal simplification of reality. And even the scientific real is more of a multiplicity than big history is willing to admit. Like, for example, just quickly.
Yeah, but just keep the humility of saying, I still have more chaos outside than I can bring in myself.
Of course. But like, look at the scientific real in terms of its big histories. And how does big history even handle this?
Sure.
You have the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. You have the multiverse. You have the idea of this Chardin omega point universe. You have this idea of cosmic evolution. All of these are different big histories in the scientific real, but we only ever talk about this one. How would it even be possible to think a many worlds interpretation of big history, or a multiverse big history, or a omega point big history? These are totally different big histories and not empirically false. They're just
So it's good
different
to identify
speculations.
these things that we've left out and can't include.
Yeah, but we only talk about this one, and then then our whole frame is this cosmic evolution. So we omit even parts of the multiplicity of the scientific real. We have this idea that the scientific real is a homogeneous thing, but it's not at all. It's a crazy multiplicity as well.
Sliding back, and then I want to give this gentleman the chance to posit his question, then we'll probably move on.
I remember 2 years ago at Dominican College, there was like the contingent of like the Buddhist transcendental group
Yeah,
and the science group.
I was there as well.
And it was like at that last meeting, it was like, whoa, well, we don't want to get too far into
Let's
the
hope the
woo.
spiritualists go away.
Yeah, and maybe that was because it was Northern California or something. But human beings really are basically a bundle of biology and belief. And if you try to shove the belief off to the side, you're missing a major part of how human beings function.
I agree.
But I can see how too human beings want to simplify. They get overwhelmed easily. Their fear response kicks in and they just run away. But it is.
I think it's how you. This is I think something I wanted to touch on more, but I agree with you. I'm just saying I think it's how do you read belief? Are you reading belief? Are you reading belief in the mode of reason, or are you reading belief in the mode of desire?
Well,
Because humans have certain desires, and if you read belief in the mode of desire, you get a totally different view of belief than if you read belief in the mode of reason. And just for example, like look at Mecca, like people revolving around the black stone of Mecca. Read it in the mode of reason, and you're like, this is ridiculous. Why are they doing that? But read it in the mode of desire, and the view totally changes.
Yeah.
Like, what are they desiring? It's kind of interesting.
We're going to give our next speaker his chance, so I'll let you, did you want to posit your question?
Oh, well, yes, it's very simple. We have the deconstruction and reconstruction of science, and when you do the problem about humanity and putting it into the context of science, you'll see that it's the evolution, as well as the civilization, is it's the earth that does it, and not ourselves, and that is an important thing because, and it's also frightful because we have to. It's a transfer of power.
Well, certainly, the Earth plays an enormous role.
And all of this is that brings them as a new vision out of big history.
That the Earth plays a role in civilization development.
Of course, it does it.
Of course, the Earth plays a role in civilization
Yeah,
development.
but that's not what the humanities say.
Well, I think the humanities place emphasis on understanding humans in civilization and the way we interpret civilization, and the way we make decisions about the future of civilization. Of course, the Earth plays a
That's
role.
all I've presented.
Okay, let's have a
Well, we're humans.
we'll have time afterwards for questions for people. I know that's the great thing about philosophy. If you're generating questions, that means you're really provoking a lot of thought. So that means it's a successful delivery.
All I want is provocation. That's all I want.
When I did my presentation, the same thing. I had 20 minutes, so that's all you can hope for. So, hand for Cadell. Frank Visser. He graduated in 1988 as psychologist of culture and religion with a specialization in psychology and mysticism. And in 82 he discovered the work of American philosopher Ken Wilber, the subject of his talk. In 97 he visited the author and wrote an introductory book about his work, which appeared in Dutch in 2001, so our Dutch people here apparently can find it in their language, and in the US in 2003 through SUNY Press. SUNY is
State University.
State University of New York.
New York.
I have been he's been involved with work ever since, and has distanced himself apparently for some reason he'll go into from Ken Wilber. He discovered a big history in the past few years. Professionally, he's never worked as an academic, but he found work in the publishing world, and later in 1999 in the internet advertising industry, where he served as a support manager for global corporate websites, and created an online portal, www.integralworld.net, which facilitates discussions about Ken Wilber's integral philosophy, and hosts 100 authors and 1,000+ essays. So, Frank Visser.
Yeah, so the disclaimer is I'm not affiliated with any university. I graduated in '88, never to return again to university, but worked in the publishing and website building industry and encountered a lot of information and continued studying. So I call myself a kind of free radical. If that's healthy, remains to be seen, but we'll see. I discovered, I did manage to publish a book at an academic publishing house. It's this book you just mentioned. This is half of Ken Wilber. Who has never heard of this guy? Like less than half, but still, it's still interesting because for me it's a kind of parallel, big history, big picture model. A little bit of one-man show, thought out by one person who has read like 300,000 books or something. I went to his house in Boulder, and he was living in the Rocky Mountains, and his whole cellar was full of books, and it's a kind of romantic story. But anyway, we will try to distill his main ideas in this talk and contrast it with big history. So this is the philosophy. Time slot. Philosophy for me is just about asking questions, asking the right questions, asking for assumptions. So we need to step back from big history and ask, is it really a framework of all knowledge, as we heard a couple of times in the conference, or is it a framework of some type of knowledge? Incidentally, I'm perfectly fine with big history being a kind of repository of settled science, what is known now. I don't really care if like the Big Bang is turned out to be a wrong idea and it's replaced with something else, so we will include it. So that's for me no controversial thing. I want to start with some humor, because this is, perhaps you know the figure of Mullah Nasruddin, a Sufi sheikh from, I looked it up at Wikipedia, Azerbaijan, at the border of Turkey. He's a living proof of that the Islam and humor can go together. It's a very funny source of stories and ideas that look stupid but turn out to be wise. And you must certainly know the story that he was looking in the night under a lamppost. He was frantically searching for something, and then some passerby said, "What are you looking for?" My house keys. I really need them." And the guy said, "Well, let me help you try to find it." And they started searching for an hour, and then the guy said, "Where did you actually lose it?" And he said, "In my house." "Yeah, but why are you looking here?" "Well, at least there is light here." And exactly the point you make, likewise, big history aligning with object science. There's more light there. But there are other worlds, other areas, universes perhaps, so-called, that are also interesting. So this is a guiding image. I can make it more explicit. Is big history really the framework of all knowledge, or only a certain type of knowledge? For example, how does consciousness fit in? Interiority, subjectivity. I heard this many times in many presentations. Can we bring back the anthropos back into the Anthropocene? Can we somehow bring back subjectivity, intersubjectivity, culture back into the whole objectivist picture of big history? Is there perhaps a kind of bias? It's of course a rhetorical question, because I would say yes. Externalist, looking at things from the outside. And if so, is some complementary approach helpful? I believe Cadell Last offers such an approach. I will keep it as simple as possible. I will introduce the guy, summarize some of his beliefs. Ethical theory is his creation, so ethical philosophy, ethical theory, it means the same. Compare it with big history and see what comes out of this clash. You can see it as two galaxies of integrated knowledge, and they almost do not overlap. And that's interesting. How come? Did we forget whole galaxies of academic knowledge? This is a more recent picture. He's in his 60s, not too healthy, has some immune system since decades. He's no longer that productive, but he is known for, this is about his reputation. I just collected some of the comments. So he has written over 25 books covering science, the humanities, spirituality, so basically the whole field of human experience. They usually call him the most translated academic author in the United States. If that academic is deserved, is open to debate, he is popular, scientific, but his intention is to really dig into whatever Buddhism, postmodernism, physics there is out there, and to integrate it into a coherent philosophy. There's a Dutch professor here at the university, Wouter. He reviewed my book and he started with the sentence, Cadell Last is an unknown celebrity. It nicely captures the fact that in some small circles he is almost worshipped as an all-knowing philosopher. And outside of those circles, nobody really seems to know him. And another praise or label he got was that he's the Einstein of consciousness research. By the way, this was his literary agent, so there's a little marketing involved. But the intention is true, that as Einstein tried to think fundamentally about matter, Cadell Last has tried to do the same for the inside of things, consciousness. And this is my book. So now you get a feel of the hype around such a person. I made a photo of my bookshelf. Just to give you an impression, since '77 he has been frequently publishing over the decades. Most of it is psychology, therapy, but for example, here's an interesting one, Up from Eden. It covers the whole history since primitive man, the magical cultures, the mythic fundamentalist empires, the modernity, rise of modernity, the rise of postmodernity. And in this philosophy they also talk about post-postmodernity, so you can imagine they really keep track of history of modern thought, but also what it means for cultures. So this is a good example of how you can bring in the subjective element back into mostly objective studies, like we hear about commerce, agriculture, everything visible in big history narratives. But what did it mean for the mind of people to start agriculture compared to a hunter? It means you have to have another time sense, have another sense of your community, even your religions change. You get religions of like the mice god, or it has to be just asks human sacrifice, and so on and so on. So he really tried to identify with the mind of these peoples and these periods. There's only one book. He was doing one book a year. Here's a book about quantum physics. He just collected writings from the major physicists to see. In those days there was a hype around Fritjof Capra, physics and mysticism, and it was more or less the same, because both of them said everything is one. Wilber just demolished that idea. So, there are different domains, different languages. It's nothing of the kind. This one is a big one, 800-page volume. It's called Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. That's a crazy title for a book. Legend has it that he asked his publisher, what sells? Publishers as well, sex. And ecology, of course. And spirituality was his field. It is a more serious attempt. Actually, it's called Cosmos. It is planned a trilogy. This was the first volume. And there was this guy from the past, I forgot his name, who traveled widely, and Fred Speer mentioned him in his book, von Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt. He also tried to summarize all available knowledge in a volume called Cosmos. He never finished it because he died and so on. I'm afraid Ken Wilber will have the same fate, because the second volume is still 20 years later to be published. I will skip that, it's just to give you an impression. Because time is limited. Highlights of his system. This is only to give you an impression how complex it is. It's really a developmental view of things, of stages of development for the individual, for society, for culture. We will come to some elements of it later. And just to give you 2 pointers, I will not present quotes too much, but this is a philosopher who is from his group, and he said in an article, an important function of integral theory is to provide a coherent narrative of cosmic, terrestrial and human development. So that's pretty much a big history attempt. If it succeeds, remains to be seen. You see in this article that he says, what is the final cosmic development? Non-dual spirit or the second law? So there are the worlds of science and religion. Some will say, we don't need spirit for this, doesn't explain anything, but it's nice to contrast. This is a quote from Wilber. I give this so you get a feel for the mind of the author. He calls the flatland the objective approach that only accepts sensory knowledge. He says, it accepts no interior domain whatsoever, and reintroducing spirit is the least of our worries. He's usually seen as a New Age author, but he says, that's the least of my worries. Our task is not specifically to reintroduce spirituality, but to the rehabilitation of the interior. So just our subjective thoughts, emotions, subjectivity is almost off the map in philosophy of mind and science. Why? Because, as Mullah and Schulin would say, there is simply more light if you talk about the brain. Talking about the mind is much more difficult. But for Wilber, it's half of the map. So the difference between big history and Wilber is quite sizable. He's very inclusive, so he tries to include as many viewpoints as possible. Everyone is right, well, up to a certain point, of course. He says that usually nobody is smart enough to be wrong all the time, so there's a grain of truth in every approach. Postmodernism, Buddhism, whatever. And the challenge is to pick that grain of truth and make it in comprehensive philosophy. one element is very important for him is that whatever you perceive depends on the perspective you take. Like if you take a third person perspective, you see facts and processes, but never think that these are the facts, because they depend on your perspective. If you take a first person perspective, you introspect in yourself, you see other things. These are also facts, no less. But you will never see that in the other perspective. So it's where do you look for your key, your house key. That comes back here many times. But still, he says, let's include all of them. But because our culture is more at home in the objective, he has focused most on the subjective, interior. So he says reality has an interior dimension as well as an exterior, and the current scientific approaches have trouble understanding the interior. We hear a lot about complexity in this conference, but not about consciousness. We hear about the brain, but not about the mind. This is the problem. Still, he says, they all have evolved. So, although Wilber is a psychologist and focusing on human beings, he just intends to go back all the way down to the first life, cell, perhaps the first atom. That makes his model a big history, a proposal. And then there's another point with which I've come to disagree in recent decades. He says this whole evolutionary drama is driven, and that's where his spiritual position comes to the fore. That's all very inspiring and nice until you think about first, for me, this would be the end of science, because if trees grow because they are driven to grow, that basically ends a scientific attempt to understand it. You could also say that's all fine, but what does that spirit do on Pluto or Mars? If the right conditions are not present, that spirit apparently is helpless. So I'm in debate with him about this, and he doesn't like that very much because it reaches the core of his system. But yeah, we have to go for truth and not for loyalty. This is a very original. He wrote that back in the early 80s. He says it's all nice and fine with science, and it does. It has a big reputation, but the two cultures problem that you have the science and the humanities. In the humanities, he says, or symbolic science, you basically follow up the same steps as a natural scientist does. You read a book, you make your own mind up about what the book is, and you discuss it with other people. It's not as hard and fast as you look through a telescope and you see 5 moons around Jupiter and you compare it with your neighbor. But it's still similar. And it is not like anything goes in the realm of mind and symbols. It triggered me very much. On top of that, he says there's even, we know of course, science and the humanities, and he says there's a third type of science you never hear of. Introspection, meditation. That's also kind of science. It's not belief, it's not dogmatism. Of course there's a cultural component, like Buddhists introspect and say there is no self, and a Hindu yogi introspects and he says there's a big self, but it's cultural varnish. If you dig deeper behind it, you could find perhaps the same structural elements. Well, that was in my younger years very fascinating, innovative. It's basically his own pet view of the philosophy of science. It's not really copied, as far as I know, by other people. But I still wanted to share it. Now we come to his basic model, the 4 quadrants. This is of course taken from the psychologists, the social sciences mostly. He says every knowledge we have can be located in one of the 4 quadrants, you can say there are two dimensions. One is the exterior, and one is the interior, and then you have the individual and the collective. So that breaks down into, we have a physical brain and body, that's the individual objective. But we have individual thoughts and emotions and states of consciousness, dreaming, sleep, ecstasy, enlightenment, whatever you want. But then we also need to look at it from the collective side. So there's always a cultural component in everything. And there's also a society component in everything. So that makes, in a very integrated way, he brings back the subjective and the intersubjective elements in our knowledge. Even to the extent that he can say, like, big history model is fine, but it's very stage dependent. It's dependent on the stage of rational scientific thinking that came up in a certain age, and it's not about facts, it's stage dependent. So it's not about what you can say naively, like, oh, there are a couple of facts and we just gather them. No, we come to these facts with a certain mindset. And that goes all the way down to the Egyptians, and whatever culture has been, and it will be in the future as well. So that makes us aware of the foundations of our knowledge. It's a very nice, catchy model. He has refined it recently to see that even within, for example, the individual interior, you still have a kind of exterior part and an interior part. So how it feels to be yourself is really subjective, but we could also postulate structures of development in your mind, and then it is more objective. Yeah, you can do the same in all this. It's a little bit too complex, but this is hardcore Wilbur. This is how he likes to think and classify phenomena. Now here it really explodes.
Is this Wilbur or is this you at this point?
Sorry?
Is this Wilbur or is this you?
No, this is Wilbur.
This is Wilbur.
Yeah, this is copied from one of his books. So you have the four quadrants, but now he makes it evolutionary. So from the beginning, you get the evolution of atoms, molecules, one cell, multicellular, blah blah blah. That is seen from the individual outside, but they also live in groups. So you have societies, blah blah blah, tribes, and they have their own cultures, and they correspond with a certain individual state of mind. And then you can make correlates, what you say. Impulsive feelings correlate with your reptilian brainstem. They were dominant in a certain society in the past, and their culture was characterized by this quality. And so you can go all the way in this scheme. It's way too complex to even start to assess it, because it crams a lot of data into a scheme that might not really fit.
Can you explain the terms I don't understand are centaur, SF1?
Yeah, that's the trouble with the writer who has invented a lot of terminology. It comes from the world of mythology, like the Uruboric is like the earthly beings that are part beast, human, and so on. That's in the end, it's a disadvantage. It makes it obscure, but anyway.
That looked like a Hindu astrology mandala, a birth chart. I wonder if some of his...
The joke I always make, he has always been quite an opponent of Jung, Carl Jung. And that has not been really well received in the Jung community, of course. But then I like to think that Jung striked back by imposing this mandalic model on his mind, and it became an obsession for Wilbur, and he has never been able to leave it behind. This is related to the last of the three elements of his ideas, that evolution is push. There is a push behind, because we go from atoms to astronauts, and he says how else can we explain this by postulating, that push? For me, that is the limit. You cross, you leave science, you enter into mystery and magic, because there are so many interesting stories to tell about how we went from atoms to astronauts. Is it now stuck? Yeah, it's stuck. Let me think. This one works. Walking through a lot of some core concepts like self-organization. That's of course also a buzzword, a hype, as if everything can be explained by self-organization. It belongs to the objective school. In my opinion, Wilber misunderstands that concept by seeing it as a force of self-organization. In my understanding, self-organization means there is no force, it self-organizes. So that's a subtle thing, but it's crucial. Because he uses some rhetoric. He says, after all, from the Big Bang and dirt to the poems of Shakespeare is quite a distance. And many philosophers of science agree that mere chance and selection are just not adequate to account for these remarkable emergences. He points to, of course, Kaufman and the school in Santa Fe. But I have always had the feeling, but then I am an amateur here, that he is missing the point and giving it a certain twist into his spiritual worldview. And as you can see, I've had heated discussions with him about his misunderstandings of evolution. You can all read that back on my website, integralworld.net, and it's really fun. Quickly, he here shows his spiritual outlook on things, but he tries to downplay it. So he says, if you want to have an alternative to the purely materialistic view, you either postulate a supernatural source, and then it can be Platonic and it's just there, or it's a kind of God, or you postulate spirit as immanent. So for him there's a spirit in everything. But he quickly says, of course it's also transcendent. So then he says, it's also a real God. But anyway, that's not possible to do in science. So he says it's immanent, and it shows up as a self-organizing, self-transcending drive within evolution. And then you can say evolution is spirit's own unfolding. Poetically, that sounds very nice. He says it's not supernatural, it's intranatural. And then I jumped on that and said, well, what does intranatural mean? No physicist will understand this. So in the end, it's just rhetoric. And that's basically the position I maintain. So finally, I got a quote from him where he says, now, this is where I stand. It boils down to that Wilber is in fact a crypto-creationist in the sense that he follows, of course he's much more sophisticated than the average creationist, but he follows the same logic. He says science tries to explain things evolutionary with chance, which of course is not true. It's a straw man. But anyway, and by chance, chance doesn't cut it. Therefore, something other than chance is needed. He calls that poetically an eros in the cosmos. There's an eros, there's a drive in the cosmos. For me that doesn't follow, because here you go wrong. And I collected statements from Richard Dawkins, for example. He has a very nice one when it comes to explaining evolutionary emergence. He says it's grindingly, creakingly, crashingly obvious that if Darwinism were a theory of chance, it couldn't work. So, in one sentence, this whole notion of science only uses chance is put aside. That undercuts most of Wilber's speculations in the field of life and matter.
Does he talk about the anthropic principle? That being another kind of
yes.
way to...
Yes.
way to bring something almost religious into physics.
Yeah, he did. He has a book, The Marriage of Sense and Soul, Integrating Science and Religion, and that's from the mid-90s, and he covers that as well. And he has his own preferred solution for it. And I found a great way to express that notion among religious people that science is just not enough to explain the complexity. I don't know if you know this is from a series of comics where Jesus and Muhammad go to a bar. And this is the barmaid, this barmaid speaking. The barmaid is here the most important person in the comic. And she mostly is right, that's the fun thing. And she says to the two guys, I think one of the reasons you boys don't accept evolution is that you don't understand it. And Muhammad says, that's just wishful thinking on your part, barmaid, says Jesus. We don't believe in evolution because we understand it only too well. It's not difficult. Read my lips. Complex life forms do not simply spring into existence by chance. And they leave the bar, and then Jesus says to Muhammad, what's so hard to understand about that? It's a very fine point made that, this is the straw man in religious circles concerning the scientific explanation of emergence and complexity.
Are we to conclude so we can have time for questions? I assume people have questions?
Many.
Yeah. So I will then have a look if there's some spicy stuff. I haven't even compared it to big history, but I did implicitly compare it to big history all the time. So big history has a privileges the objective, the collective description of reality. Cadell would say, well, that is fine as long as you are aware that it is one perspective. He introduces more this intersubjective, subjective stuff. That's all fine, but then he overreaches when he says, and I also understand evolution and Darwinism, and I even understand how the elements were made. And that's why he even blunders, because he says, that is such a transcendental process, because from hydrogen to helium, what happens there? A mystery, from helium to oxygen. Fantastic. That kind of kindergarten analysis is not what cuts in the field of science, because in fact science has such an interesting story. There's a book called The Magical Furnace, which describes this whole discovery of how the elements were made. Well, anyway, you get the feeling where I stand regarding Wilbur. He has been a long time hero of mine. I wrote a book of him. Then I faded out a little bit. There was some quarrels and heated debates. But I'm still thinking he has so many original proposals, like, especially when it comes to taking a step back from science and saying, hey, what is left out? What could we include in the bigger picture? So it really becomes a big picture.
Can we go to questions?
That's
okay, so one of the advantages of this happening before lunch is that whoever wants to leave at 12:30 can just go down. If you want to get lunch early, you can. Obviously, usually there's plenty of food. So if some people want to stay later and ask Cadell and Frank here some questions, feel free to do so. So open the floor to questions. You got a question?
Yeah, I have a question. It's basically a question on both speakers, I think, because in both of the talks we heard like what is left out of big history. It says it's big, but some things are left out. And in both stories, both presentations, there was the question of isn't the knowledge of big history biased in that it is only empirical? But the question I think we need to address then is, why is empirical science so successful, and why would you want to include something more? What's the relevance of that? So what are you up against? And I think that scientific knowledge has a big characteristic: it's testable. So it's testable in the sense that you can point out where it's wrong. And a good scientist will tell you,
Yeah.
if you come up with this evidence, it's wrong. So then I will back down and say, you're right, or I have to reformulate my
Okay.
formula.
Can I give the example of Dick Swaap, the guy
Yeah,
who
so-
wrote the book We Are Our Brain in Dutch?
Okay, but now my question is really,
Yeah.
so if you want to add something to big history, you are coming up and you say it's too narrow to just point at empirical evidence. What about the testability of bringing in new things? Because if it's not testable, it's irrelevant. Then it's just a nice theory which can do something at a conference maybe.
Yeah, but I hope
no
I
more
made
than that.
clear that it's not a matter of there's science and there's fantasy. What he argued for, there's science, sensory science, and there's a symbolic understanding of the world, and there's even a non-symbolic understanding of the world. And we can make some considered opinions, statements there, although it's never as hard as real science. But that is where he works, in that area. So
you say, I'm not buying that,
Yeah.
the spiritual
Yeah.
part of
Yeah.
his story.
But in your question,
Why not?
Could I give the example of Dick Swaap? He says, we are our brains. And I always feel, true, if you take a third-person perspective, then you only see brains of people. But if you include the first-person perspective, at least you have to acknowledge there's other stuff going on. We will never see a thought if we look from the outside. We see brain processes and patterns. We could perhaps guess the emotional nature of a thought, but not the content. That's my, perhaps naive, but that's my conviction. And what triggers me is that could there be efforts of investigation that cover that field as well? Of course, you run into the mind-body problem head on, which isn't solved. But it's too easy for me to say, consciousness is kind of emergent capacity of the brain or something. Like water comes out of a faucet. That's completely, you step out of a completely different ontological domain. So yeah.
Another question?
You mentioned you had a website, but I couldn't gather.
Integral world. .net.
Thank you.
But you can always Google Frank Visser and it brings you wherever you want. You can Google my name and it will.
I think I did that and I didn't find you. Sorry.
Then I would be interested to see. Yes.
Well, two simple thoughts. I'm back to really loving the notion that chaos acquires order by virtue of what we choose to omit. And one thing I think he's missed, I mean, he's so complex, is on the spirituality thing and chance thing, and it can't happen by chance. I'm happy going back to the Greeks who said it's fate and chance. Fate meaning the workings, the logical workings out of the stuff you're starting with.
The lawfulness,
and
yeah.
chance, sort of the randomness that
exactly.
occurs, and
Yeah.
that, for me, that does it. That includes
But why does it convince you and somebody else say, I just don't buy it because
Habit?
DNA, come on.
habit
By
and
chance
personal
and
tastes
some laws, it's so complex. I can understand the emotional response of people to that. But my loyalty is with science because it says it's basically the only way we have and we make progress.
But what is the relevance of disputing, of saying it's miraculous? If you want to work at a DNA laboratory, your personal emotion doesn't mean
Absolutely,
anything.
I agree.
So,
Actually,
what's the relevant question
It's
here?
noise. It's noise. Yeah.
It's noise. So, what's the relevant question here?
Yeah. But I've tried to say that there is an area where Kim Wilber is brilliant and helpful and innovative. There's an area where he overreaches, and there's an area where he blunders. And that's exactly the sequence backwards in time, from mind to life to matter. He claims he covers everything, but he doesn't. So that's my considered opinion.
Yes.
Bill Bryson, your title?
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill Bryson.
Yeah, and that's because of the time, because here, of course, exactly the point we reached. He wrote this book, probably everybody knows that and loves it.
Yeah.
And Ken Wilber wrote A Brief History of Everything. I translated that into Dutch and it was my Bible for years. And then I discovered that book and I noticed they talk about completely different fields. So here you have the objective sciences, and he stops where man arrives on the scene, human beings, and we are the restless ape. And Ken Wilber starts there and follows that trajectory. And so
And
that
Wilber's
triggered my mind.
predates Bryson's. Wilber's came before Bryson's.
I just had a comment too, that chance, you gotta know the numerator and the denominator. So the chance of life being in a galaxy, anyone galaxy, we know there's 100 billion stars, so how many of those have planets, how many is solid? And then you gotta know for DNA, mutations. So they figured out recently that maybe hydrogen tunneling actually increases mutation beyond from radiation and so forth. So that changes the numerator. So anyway, so chance might be less chancy than we think. I should be throwing this out as a moderator, but I couldn't help it. Any other questions? Yes.
I guess a question as a neophyte to big history. Does big history claim to unify all human knowledge? That was my because it seems like a unification of history and natural sciences.
It's a scientific approach.
And I'd say, let's take something not less controversial than spirituality. Say art. Almost everybody says art is a valuable and important thing, as long as we don't talk about individual works. But does big history say? And I can see big history inspiring art, but I don't see it as drawing much from art.
Big history explains the origin of art.
Just have big historians, and they each have their own opinion and their own data and their own huge pile of stuff they've implemented and don't understand. It's a mistake to think that big history speaks.
And yes, obviously, art is something created by carbon-based life forms. At least that would be. But I don't know that it gains us an enormous amount of information.
Any questions for Frank or Cadell? Am I mispronouncing it?
No.
You got it right, okay.
Well, I'm allowed.
Well, all right, so let's have a I found these fascinating and
I'd like to do it.
I'm not sure anybody would